Sometimes when I need to buy a greetings card for someone, either for a birthday or for Christmas, for Mother's Day, whatever it is, I will struggle to find the card that I want to purchase in order to try to say to them something which I think could be somewhat in my voice. Either they are a nice design on the front and a little bit too much inside, or sometimes it's a good design and nothing inside. You just look and it's a couple of words and it's just not going to be enough. And then it just makes you wonder, am I just buying this in a bit of a kind of an impulse purchase? So the 3-brush technique starts off with the largest brush. Now I'm using 3 round head brushes for this and watercolour paints. So if we count them off, in the top left corner I will put brush number 1. And this large brush, you make the big marks that are going to be the shapes that define the composition of the image. And they're also the most watered down initially, when it comes to watercolour at least. This is because watercolour works in layers, and even though this technique works best on white paper, the technique of building up layers from transparent to opaque is going to be the most effective. So the transparency is diluting the paint, the pigment with the water, and having the colours as light as possible, and then gradually adding darker and darker tones. Now the composition isn't exactly correct based on the photographic reference. At some point in the future I will start to show the photo reference that I use for some of these images, but for the time being it's just going to be my assurance that it doesn't matter. The reference is for you, it's not for the person who sees the painting or receives the card. If you ever exhibit paintings, you don't need them to be really accurate with the proportions or the composition. It's just a guide. It's not always about accuracy. If you want to do that, there's different ways of doing that. For me, it's a guide. And with this, it was a process of making mistakes and pulling them back and trying to find a healthy balance of what works and what doesn't. Now I'm doing quite a lot with this first brush. As you can tell, it's a large brush, but you can paint a lot in with the largest brush, because really what you're trying to do is cover the most space as quickly as possible. But with watercolours that can be tricky, because if you are using a heavy diluted mix like I am here, then it takes longer to dry, and it's worth waiting for them to dry before you start to apply the darker layers, because the colours will run, and unless that's something that you're doing intentionally, it won't always work. Now we're on to the second brush. It's smaller and the tones immediately go darker. This is where you start to really establish some of the shapes and the important parts of the painting that you're trying to use as characters for the image. Now, it's hard to tell. You can see that there are plant pots here, but in the center I have a bird bath, and it's just a little plastic lid filled with water for some sparrows. But that's something which you can barely see at this point. It's just vague shapes, and the smaller the brush goes, the more opportunity you have to define these shapes. So you get in things like flowers and petals and darker shadow shapes and bits of light definition in certain areas. But you may still cover large portions of the surface with this middle brush because it's not tiny. It's worth having it being large enough that you can still make enough changes in certain areas. So if you need to build up a certain shape like I'm doing here, then that will be possible because it's not a tiny brush. You don't want to really make things very difficult for yourself. Now here you can see it's still a very watery mix, but that's not a bad thing. It's just that's where you try to make sure that you're keeping things tonally balanced. By that I mean the things in the foreground should pop out and be stronger in pigment and in tone. And I just mean the tonal values as in the lights and darks. Things that you're focusing on should be more vibrant and have lights and darks a little bit more poppy and easier to focus on than anything that you want to recede in the background. So I try to define certain shapes of leaves and make expressionistic marks here and there, because a lot of it is about experience as well as a kind of vague recollection. And these things become more vibrant because of the pigment that you have available to you in a watercolor set, and I think you should capitalize on that if you appreciate that style. But you do always have the opportunity to mix it as you wish. Now on this painting, there have been several occasions where I've made a mark or laid down a color and changed my mind. So I just wet the area, grab a tissue or a piece of a roll of some sort, and then press it down gently and lift it back up. And here, this is the point where we're onto the third brush. Now that I've got down all of those shapes, I'm now using the smallest brush and I'm putting in the details on the little sparrows and touching up certain areas for the plants, because this is the point where you're doing the last final polish and getting ready to leave it as a finish. And it doesn't have to be incredibly sharp everywhere. That's where I leave it, and I think it's actually quite a pleasant and successful painting for a gift card. Okay, so that is the card finished, and I think it worked out quite nice. Here it is. This is the finished product. I quite like it. I think it's got quite a nice, because it opens, you know, from both sides. So I've got the front, and then you open it up and it's, you know, almost like a, I don't know, kind of a, what do you call it, triptych kind of thing. I've got a couple of other examples of cards that I've painted here. So this is one which I did as a card, I think it was a couple of years ago, and this is acrylic. And then for the other watercolour that I did, this is watercolour painting that I did again, I think it was a couple of years ago. I think if you can try to paint on card, if you're anything like me, you'll find that easier than what you will painting for yourself or just trying to get paintings done. If you have the pressure of, I haven't bought a card, I want to give someone a card that's special, try to, you know, do a painting on there, because there's always something which you can pull out of the bag when the pressure's on. Again, if you're anything like me, which I always work better that way.